Alright, everybody, sit down. Shut up. Class has started. As promised, Professor Tone's first class is going to show you how to rob an estate from a lonely, dying person, based on the methods deployed by Mark Clements, a former Middlesex County, New Jersey homicide detective and private investigator, against the estate of my uncle, Norman Cullen Jr., the former deputy chief of the Somerset County, New Jersey prosecutor's office. Yes, you heard that introduction correctly. If you plan on robbing an estate, all you have to do is follow the methods of Mark Clements' scumbaggery, and you should succeed. Especially if you live in the corrupt to the core state of New Jersey, if you have law enforcement and political connections, and you deal with a bunch of careless and incompetent government officials who could care less about anything, let alone doing their job properly. I would like to also add that there will be little to no positivity in this presentation. This is a scorched earth production. My family was conned out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the law did absolutely nothing about it. So if you don't like negativity, aka hearing the cold hard truths about life, I suggest you go watch The Church of Positivity with Tony Robbins or one of those other self-help con artists who will be more than glad to con you out of your money so them and their homies can go on a spiritual retreat to Fiji. So before we go into the timeline of events proving that Mark Clements committed fraud and possibly even helped accelerate Norman's death for all we know, let me take a second to say that this is not a bitch fest of bitterness about Mark Clements getting everything from my uncle's estate and me and my family getting nothing. I had a falling out with my uncle back in 2018, and it had been brewing for a couple of years before that. My uncle was severely bipolar. I could no longer deal with him and flat out said many times I don't want or need or care to have a thing from him, and I stuck by that as we hadn't spoken since 2018. He had quite a few enemies in law enforcement. He ratted his way to the top of the Somerset County, New Jersey prosecutor's office during the fall of the Nick Bissell administration in the mid-90s, a topic we are going to deep dive into in the upcoming weeks. Former Somerset County Prosecutor's Office Detective Richard Myers accurately described my uncle as having erratic martial arts behavior. Oh God, that's a funny analogy. Still, despite my animosity towards my uncle, he was still my uncle, and I try to remember the good times we had throughout my life, and this is certainly not the way I wanted it to end. So it goes. I knew Mark Clements very well. He's pictured here. If Santa Claus and the Quaker Oats guy had a kid, his name would be Mark Clements. Now, despite knowing what a crooked cop he was, I always spoke highly of him because the guy was good to me about a decade ago. He hooked me up with a bunch of security gigs when he was a regional manager for Allied Universal, and he got me started doing private investigations with a company started by my uncle, him, and myself called National Security Services. I came up with that name. Sounds official. For those couple years I worked with him, I actually liked him better than my uncle. When I moved to Florida in 2018, Mark and I parted ways on very good terms. At least I thought we did. I thanked him for all his help, and he even offered to get me security gigs in Florida if I wanted, as he stated he knew a lot of people in the South Florida area with Allied Universal. However, his actions regarding the theft of my uncle's estate and keeping his death a secret from my family are unforgivable. I can assure you that the level of greed, deceit, and arrogance demonstrated by this jiggle and jello gut who somehow still hasn't died from diabetes or heart disease is unlike anything you've ever seen on any Dateline or true crime episode. And the level of corruptness demonstrated by the Ewing Police Department to cover up the evident estate fraud committed by their fellow boy in blue, as well as the incompetent and utter careless attitude various government and law enforcement agencies of the state of New Jersey had towards my family, and this apparent fraud that Mark Clements committed is reprehensible, and all parties involved are not deserving of an ounce of respect for myself and my family, nor will they get any. So let's start from the beginning of the nightmare my family and I have lived through this year so that this fat piece of trash who already has plenty of money could make himself hundreds of thousands of dollars richer. On March 2nd, 2025, my mother receives two Facebook messages from friends and former professional law enforcement colleagues of my uncle, Norman Cullen Jr., offering their condolences for his passing. This came as quite a shock to my mother, as she had no idea her brother was dead. My mother and Norman had a rocky relationship, but for his last year of life they were in frequent communication and were on good terms and had made amends. The last communication they had was on January 14, 2025, when my mother asked Norman how he was feeling, as he had told her previously that the cancer he had overcome several years ago had returned months prior. He said that he had to see a specialist because there was a blockage around his heart, and therefore they needed to stop chemotherapy. She offered to help him and come to his house in Ewing, New Jersey to make sure everything was fine and help him with anything he may need help with, but he said not to worry as everything is taken care of. She tried texting him several times throughout the next month and received no reply, and their text message receipts were shown as delivered and not read. Same with my godmother, who was a cousin of Norman and my mother, as she had also been trying to get in contact with him to check on his status, as she was also a cancer survivor. Those unread text messages showed up as read messages the very next day on Monday, March 3rd, 2025. That is the same day Mark Clements filed Norman's will with the surrogate's office in the state of New Jersey, so that the will would go directly to probate and would have to be contested in court. You see, within the first month of someone's passing, next of kin can file a caveat with the surrogate's court in the state of New Jersey, which halts the probate process and the matter is then handled in superior court. But considering Mark Clements kept Norman's death a secret from everyone for one whole month, no caveat could be filed to object the will's probate and Mark's appointment as executor. I really want this to sink into everyone that he told no one Norman died until the day before he filed Norman's will with the surrogate's office, so no caveat could be filed. Usually when someone who has achieved a high-profile public position, such as deputy chief of a county prosecutor's office, there's usually a decent amount of attention to such a passing at the local level. There's usually a write-up in the local newspapers, an obituary, and some sort of tribute among friends and family, even if the deceased didn't want a viewing or funeral service. But when the death is kept secret so that a sociopath who pretended to be the decedent's friend only to defraud his family to steal all of his assets, none of those acknowledgments occurred, and someone who held a prestigious position is like a ghost that never existed. So how did Norman's first friend and professional colleague who offered his condolences to my mother find out from Mark Clements about Norman's death? He had contacted Mark on March 2nd to tell him about the passing of another colleague they had worked with in Somerset County. This is when Mark decided to say, "Oh, by the way, Norman passed away." This friend told another friend of Norman's who was in law enforcement, and that is how they contacted my mother, as those were two of Norman's friends whom she knew. Later that day, my mother was able to find the phone number for a lifelong friend of Norman's since their childhood days in Piscataway, New Jersey, and she left him a voicemail. This friend is an attorney in Ohio. Norman had always said to us if anything bad were to happen to get in contact with this friend, as he would know what to do. This friend contacted my mother later that day, and she told him about Norman's passing. He dropped to his knees in tears. He had no idea his friend had been dead for a month and was outraged. He contacted one of the friends of Norman who had contacted my mother and got Mark Clements' phone number from him. My family and I found it very odd that this lifelong friend had no knowledge of Norman's passing. The next day, Mark Clements returned this friend's call and said that he had tried calling him to inform him of Norman's death, but the phone number was out of service. This friend told my mother that is complete BS, as he's had the same number for years, and his number was never out of service. He was already suspicious that Mark Clements had done something shady. He told Mark to contact my mother and let her know what is going on. This friend told my mother he doesn't care what he has to do, but he is going to get to the bottom of this. That never happened. To be fair, he did have some heart issues the very next day, which hospitalized him, but he definitely could have helped more in the legal process, which he told us he was going to do. Anyways, Mark Clements contacts my mother via text message, in which he states, "You will be getting a letter from Norm's attorney." He asked her for her address so the letter could be sent. Didn't offer his condolences or anything. Norman's attorney, James Fitzgerald, passed away a year earlier, and the attorney on the will and death certificate is listed as per se, which means self-represented. Hence, Norman didn't have an attorney. There is also an address listed for my mother on the will. It's an address for a different woman with the same name as my mother. So why is he asking for an address if he has one, right? We'll get back to that. Also, no letter has been sent from Norm's phantom attorney to this date. When my mother explained to him how devastating it was to find out about our brother's passing on Facebook and that they had been on good terms, and when she asked what was done with his remains, he said, "Unfortunately, no one had any way of getting in contact with you." And he asked her for her address again and refused to reply to her after that. I'm sure he'll say he was so busy working he completely forgot, rather than not wanting to message anything over the phone that might incriminate himself of his crimes. Considering there's a very good chance Mark had Norman's cell phone in his possession since probably before Norman passed away, which many of us believe to be the case, he could have found her number there. He could have asked Norman for it before he passed. Even more incriminating, you expect me to believe a former homicide detective and private investigator with access to skip track and trace programs had no way of finding a phone number for his dead friend's sister, which appears 4 times on the very first page of a Google search? Myself and everyone who hears that finds that impossible to believe. I would like to add that my uncle always acted like he was some sort of double agent, and he was very secretive, telling one group of friends some aspects of his life and telling other groups of friends completely different aspects of his life, so that no one would ever know his whole story. My mother felt that Norman didn't want to be a burden on her in his dying days, as he knew it was very stressful for her to run back and forth to help take care of their dying father, my grandfather, in 2016 when Norman lived that estate. He also said he never wanted to see any of his family see him in a dying state, like how we saw our Uncle Clifford wither away from cancer many years ago. He would either say if he knew he was terminally ill that he was going to just go on a walkabout until he passed away, or he would go to the woods and blow his head off. He didn't do either A or B, but he did hold true to his word on not letting his family see him dying because he didn't want his family members to ever see him weak. Those were words he had spoken to me in the past. Me, my mother, and my 2 sisters went on a week-long mission trying to find out what happened to Norman, considering Mark Clements couldn't be bothered to answer, as he was likely too busy finalizing the sale of his waterfront property in Virginia, where he told Norman's friend he was moving to. My mother had last tried calling Norman on February 24th, and had tried texting him several times since January 14th when they last communicated. Since we had no idea where he even was when he passed away, we tried calling hospitals and government agencies throughout New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, all states where he had lived, as we weren't even certain if he died in New Jersey, as he simply never knew with him where he was living. My mother had told us that Norman said despite not being in contact with me and often being distant from my sisters, that he still intended for us to have everything in his name. He had also asked the eldest of my 2 sisters for her information so he could have her listed as a beneficiary years ago when he was first diagnosed with cancer. As we would later find out, he left several life insurance policies in my mother's name, the most recent being with New York Life Insurance in September of 2024 when he briefly worked with Allied Universal, a policy that Mark was certainly aware of, as he likely got him hired with Allied as a security officer, and Mark unsuccessfully tried to claim the life insurance as executor of the will. But life insurance doesn't care who is listed as the executor of the will, as they go by who is listed as the beneficiary on the policy. Yet we were supposed to believe on Norman's deathbed that he wanted his entire will changed for his friend to have everything. We'll get back to that. My mother contacted our cousin, who was a retired Jersey City police lieutenant and who had kept in touch with Norman over the years. He said he believes Mark is involved in a scam involving Norman's death to take control of his assets, bank account, and credit cards. Him and my mother searched for death records of Norman in various states, but no records were showing. He contacted a friend of his who was a funeral director in Jersey City, and this friend informed him that no cremation can be performed without permission from next of kin, which would begin with my mother. The eldest of my two sisters also contacted a friend of hers whose husband is a funeral director in New Jersey, and he said he was not seeing any records of death, hospital, cremation, or burial for Norman either. The youngest of my two sisters sent a message to Mark asking him for the contact information of the attorney who would be contacting my mother, but received no response because it's such a big secret for someone covering up their crimes to reply. After contacting several coroner's offices, my mother finally found out from the Mercer County Medical Examiner's office that they had a record of Norman at the Beneficiary Funeral Home in Ewing, New Jersey, as he was brought there upon his death rather than being brought to the morgue, and they had paperwork showing Mark Clements was his power of attorney. My mother contacted the Beneficiary Funeral Home, who informed her that Norman was buried at the Fountain Lawn Memorial Park in Ewing, New Jersey, and that he had in fact passed away at his residence in Ewing on February 2nd, 2025. The manager of the funeral home said there was no funerary service, that there was a direct burial where only the funeral home staff were present, and that they said a prayer for him as he was buried. She said it was a very sad affair. My mother will have more correspondence with the funeral home, so we will return to them shortly. Our cousin from the Jersey City Police Department contacted the Ewing Police Department and received the case number from them from the day of the 911 call on the day that Norman passed away, which they said my mother could pick up the next day when she planned on going to Norman's house, which she still had a key for, unbeknownst to Mark Clements. Our cousin also advised her to see if they could expedite processing a police report about a potential fraud involving Norman's estate with Mark Clements. The next day, my mother spoke to Norman's first ex-wife, who she is still close with. I wish she had remained my aunt, as we all loved her. How she stayed with my uncle for 15 years is a lifetime achievement award unto itself. She stated that she found out about Norman's passing through the wife of the first of Norman's friends who had contacted my mother on Facebook. She said she advises getting a lawyer, as there is no doubt in her mind that Mark pulled some sort of fraud to get a hold of Norman's estate. She says she does not believe, despite any problems Norman may have had with me, my mother, and my sisters, that he would have left us out of his will. She said to my mother, "You know I have no love lost for your brother, but despite his hard shell, there was a goodness to him deep down, and he did love to play hero." She also stated she's certain that if she would have called him in the middle of the night at any time after they got divorced and asked for his help, that he would have came and helped her. She said he would have held it over her head for the rest of her life, which he would have, but he still would have helped. My mother later spoke to Norman's childhood friend attorney in Ohio again, and he stated it's his professional opinion that Mark engaged in fraud to get a hold of Norman's estate, and that he may have made himself power of attorney when Norman was dying of cancer on pain medication, which is undue influence, as he believes Mark was likely aware that Norman had a lot of assets, such as stocks, the house he had paid off in Ewing, a $30,000 Rolex, vehicles, and whatever amount of money was in his bank account and lines of credit that he had. He advised her to find a lawyer in Mercer County, New Jersey that practices will and estate contesting, as he's not licensed in New Jersey to represent us. Isn't it amazing that as soon as people hear just a fraction of the details of this case, that they instantly believe Mark committed fraud? But then there's the Ewing Police Department. Knowledge, integrity, courage is their slogan. My family received idiocy, corruption, and cowardness from this bacon brigade. My mother went to the Ewing Police Department to get a copy of the police report for the 911 call that was made on the day of Norman's death, which they said we would be able to obtain. and after two officers closed the window on her and deliberated for 10 minutes, they informed her that they cannot give her a copy of the police report unless she has an attorney present. This is just the beginning of the gross incompetence and blatant cover-up for Mark Clements, deployed by the Ewing Police Department pork roll platoon. My mother then went to the Fountain Lawn Memorial Park in Ewing, New Jersey. Would you get a look at this void of space and time? It's a literal potter's field. This is where they bury inmates and welfare recipients with no family members to claim them. She found a cemetery representative there who told her that Norman was buried there on February 7th and that there was no request for a headstone. He gave her a map of the general area where he is buried. Later that day, my sister's friend's husband, who was a funeral director, said the medical examiner, the funeral home, and the cemetery were all supposed to have looked for a next of kin, but none of them did, and all would claim that it is not their responsibility to do so, as this is just one giant finger-pointing game. My mother then went to Norman's house in Ewing, and the key she had still worked. She took photos and videos of the condition of the home, which was an utter mess. She found blood droplets in the living room where Norman passed away, a walker in the living room which he likely used to move around from the couch where he was staying in his final days due to the immense pain he was in, a bathroom sink close to the living room full of ice packs to keep Pepsi and Yoo-Hoo cold. Not sure why they had to be put there, as the bathroom is equidistant to the refrigerator in the kitchen, but I'm sure his caretaker nurse, Mark Clements, had a good reason for it. And the office, which looked like a Tasmanian devil ran through it, was ransacked with paperwork scattered everywhere. More than likely, Mark was looking for something, likely existing copies of Norman's previous will, which had his immediate family listed as beneficiaries. Funny how he couldn't find any contact information for Norman's family through all that scattered paperwork he tore through. I mean, he even tore through the clothes drawers. She notes that most of the paperwork left is from her parents, who have been deceased for a decade, and that Mark likely took the pertinent paperwork belonging to Norman. If Mark wants to claim my mother ransacked the home, there are cameras across the street at the Parkside Elementary School which can show the time she was there to the time she left, and that will prove there definitely wasn't enough time to leave the house in that ransacked condition. I have a very hard time believing a dying cancer patient was destroying his own home in his last days. But I'm sure Mark Clements will say his friend was so determined to find paperwork for him that his final mission in life was to get him whatever he needed. There were also several bottles of wine that were half empty or half full. Clearly remember Mark being a connoisseur of cheap, disgusting wine. My mother later spoke to her cousin, my godmother, and she stated she tried calling Norman for several weeks, but the number would just keep ringing. She also believes Mark has been in possession of Norman's phone, which clearly wasn't to be found in the house, and that he probably just read the text messages a few days ago after he sent the will to probate. My mother's husband sent out a tester text to Norman's cell phone, and he showed my mother that it was just read. The next day, my mother returned to the house with her husband. He noticed there were 2 empty boxes of firearms that were shipped to the house just weeks before Norman's passing. They couldn't locate those firearms in the home, as well as other firearms my mother knew Norman possessed. They called the Ewing police to file a report about the missing firearms. 2 police officers arrived and acknowledged what a mess the house was. They said the blood droplets are likely from the heart pricks from when the paramedics arrived on the day Norman passed, which my mother had assumed. They said they can't file a police report about the missing firearms because there are no signs of forced entry in the home, and to let them know if the firearms turn up. As my police cousin said, missing firearms could likely be stolen firearms, which is an automatic felony investigation. But the Ewing police said nothing to see here. When my mother and her husband left the house, they were greeted by a neighbor of Norman's. He said Norman was a very nice man and that Norman had let him store some of his belongings in his garage when he moved in. He stated that Norman had told him that he had family in New Jersey, But then on the day of Norman's passing, when he went outside to speak with Mark Clements, who he referred to as the guy in the black truck, and asked him about Norman's family, that Mark stated Norman didn't have any family. He said he's not sure what kind of care Mark was giving Norman, because he said he's around most of the time, and he only saw Mark there one other time for a few minutes until the day of Norman's passing, in which he states about 20 minutes after he arrived, the police and paramedics had come. He said he saw him a few days later loading bar paintings and various other items into his truck. The neighbor stated that a few weeks before Norman passed away, he found him one morning lying unconscious on the driveway with his face purple from the fall. He called 911 and he believes when the paramedics arrived, Norman refused treatment. He then stated he saw two notaries at Norman's home a week before he passed away, and he knew that they were notaries because he asked them who they were, and they told him they were there to have documents notarized. He said, I'm the black neighbor, so if I see two black people standing around, I gotta find out what's up. I thought that was funny. I'm sure these two Princeton, New Jersey notaries were paid by Mark Clements to come to the house and sign his fraudulent will. And I'm sure they'll state that Norman was of sound mind when they came and he was zipping around that house with his walker at warp speed a week before he passed away from terminal cancer. The neighbor said he believes Mark is very suspicious and that he believes in his heart that he left Norman in that house to die alone. He said the other two people he lives with believe that something fishy happened, but told him not to get involved. When my mother spoke to her police lieutenant cousin and Norman's attorney friend, they couldn't believe the Ewing police wouldn't give her a copy of the police report, as that it's public record. My mother had found a few checks Norman had signed laying around, and one of them was for National Security Services, which was the private investigation company I worked for with my uncle and Mark. They likely had just started doing work again in the past year when Norman returned to New Jersey, as Mark would still do PI work on the side, and it was likely a tax shelter for both of them to write off expenses. My cousin stated if they were doing business together a few months ago, that there is a good chance Mark had access to Norman's accounts and passwords. The next day, my mother spoke to two different attorneys who she knows in other fields of practice, and they both said Norman was illegally buried, as next of kin is supposed to make decisions on cremation and burial because next of kin trumps power of attorney at death. This same day, she spoke to the director of the Brenisolini Funeral Home, who stated that Mark Clements presented them with a will showing that he was the executor. The director said that Norman had requested for his body to be cremated, but she told Mark that a cremation cannot be performed without next of kin. Mark says there is no next of kin, and he has a sister, who he hates, who he has no way of contacting because he doesn't even know her name, even though he knew her name when he created his fraudulent will and listed her address as that of a different woman with the same name, but he will swear Norman put that address there. The director said that you cannot have Norman's body cremated without approval from the next of kin. Mark then stated to bury Norman as a ward of the state, which is a burial designated for the likes of deceased inmates who have no one to claim them and welfare recipients with no next of kin. She stated Norman's body is buried about 20 feet deep in a plot with 3 to 5 other people, and because of this, there's no way the cemetery would even be able to exhume his body. He was not embalmed, he did not have a vaulted casket, and rigor mortis is likely taking place. She added it's not the job of the funeral home to search for a next of kin if the executor states there is no next of kin, and this is what gives the funeral home the authority to bury a body. She said Mark chose the cheapest burial option, and him and his wife didn't attend the burial, as he stated he had to leave the state on a business matter. My mother was able to receive a copy of Norman's death certificate from the state of New Jersey, which states that the cause of death was underlying complications due to chemotherapy for cancer. Now let's remember that more than 2 weeks before Norman's passing, he told my mother that they had to stop chemotherapy due to the infection near his heart. So if that's true, he did not die of complications from chemotherapy. When my mother and her husband were going through the paperwork and items they brought back from Norman's home, They noticed there was a delivery for an erectile dysfunction pill called Slidafil that was ordered to his home. It's hard to believe he was going out with a bang when dying from cancer, as that's not even an option when you're in that kind of pain. I wonder if his night nurse, Mark Clements, was feeding him those pills, telling him it was some sort of pain medication. It clearly states not to take the ED pills if you are having heart issues. For all we know, he could have been feeding Norman some other drugs that accelerated his death. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We will get back to the examination, or lack thereof, of Norman's corpse very soon. The death certificate says Norman's attorney is pro se, which, as I stated earlier, means he was self-represented, so there is no attorney. He is also listed as divorced. He was divorced twice, but the information Mark Clements failed to provide is that Norman was actually widowed. As my mother found out when she spoke to a representative from life insurance policies from the New Jersey State Pensions, we found out Norman was married to a woman named Maria, who no one knew he was actually married to except for one of his friends in Ohio who he attended the FBI academy with. A number of people knew they were dating, but not that they were married. Maria had passed away several years ago due to breast cancer. The death certificate also has my mother listed as next of kin, but again, the address listed is of someone else with the same name in Barnegat, New Jersey. So obviously Mark had looked up information for the next of kin, considering my uncle wouldn't have put the wrong address as he knew where my mother lived in Piscataway, New Jersey. Oh, speaking of addresses, the address Mark Clements lists in Bensalem, Pennsylvania is not his address. This was an address he used to circumvent paying income tax on his New Jersey police pension. Mark moved from his McMansion in Pennington, New Jersey almost 10 years ago to live 1 block away from the beach in Long Branch, New Jersey, but he'd use a Bensalem, Pennsylvania address for all his business and personal matters. How do I know this? I clearly remember the individual who lives at that address telling me that he told Mark he could use his address back in 2016 when Mark was openly talking about needing a Pennsylvania address so he wouldn't have to pay state income tax on his pension. That individual, who was a very nice guy who I hope is doing well, was a security officer at Allied Universal who I worked security with at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia back in 2016. It's hard to believe Mark Clements was shacking up in a bungalow in Bensalem with one of his employees when he had a house 1 block away from the ocean in Long Branch with his wife. The New Jersey Pension Board was contacted about this fraud. They did nothing about it. They stated they will look into the matter and that they don't disclose the results or happenings of their investigation. In layman's terms, that translates to we're going to do nothing about this, and the taxpayers in New Jersey can continue to pay about $100,000 a year for this fat slob to hog more oxygen with his existence. The next day, my mother goes to the surrogate's office and finally can get a copy of the will, which shows that Mark Clements is the executor and that his wife, listed as Norman's dear friend Michelle, gets everything from Norman's estate. Now, back in 2016, when we first started working private investigations with Mark Clements, my uncle told me that he had met Mark's wife and 2 kids a few times and stated that they were very nice people. I myself also met his wife and 2 kids, and I agree, I said the same thing. Now, there's a big difference between thinking someone you met a few times is a nice person, and then on your dying death sofa granting them your entire estate. So unless my uncle and dear friend Michelle were kicking it on the regular these last few years when I was out of contact with my uncle, I would have to believe that Mark, in his fraudulent will, which we were going to pick apart, put her as the sole beneficiary, so if he was removed as executor, she would still be the beneficiary, and then he could still have all his business and dirty dealings involved with all the transactions from Norman's estate separate from his name. Let's remember, he's a former homicide detective who I'm sure has come across cases of fraudulent wills and estate theft. He knows exactly how to maneuver in this system. And I have an impossible time believing that 8 days before his death that Norman had the fortitude and mental capacity to draw up this sudden change of heart will or he wanted his friend's wife to have everything he owned and worked for. There's a paragraph in the will where supposedly Norman states that he has a sister and he is aware she is family. Obviously, he's aware considering he was around us our entire lives. But he has had no contact with any of us for 10 years and does not wish for us to benefit from his passing or the residue of his estate. So if he wished for us to get nothing, then why was he leaving life insurance policies in my mother's name months before he passed? Why didn't he remove her as the beneficiary of his life insurance policies from years ago? He was in contact with her until 2 weeks before he passed away. He was in contact with two of his cousins, my godmother and the retired Jersey City police lieutenant, who were brother and sister. He helped the oldest of my two sisters get a house by co-signing the mortgage for her, and was helping her pay a student loan in the amount of $200 a month until the day he passed, when the loan was then transferred to her. And he definitely knew he was paying the loan, even if it was auto-debited, as he knew everything going in and out of his checking account, and he can remember down to the cent the amount of money he lent you many, many years ago. He was buying her son gifts until the year he passed away. The only person who he hadn't spoke to from the family in almost 10 years was me, and that was 7 years to be exact. I'm the one who Mark knew best from Norman's family. So he knew about my fallout with Norman, and he was estimating about 10 years when he was concocting this fraudulent will, based on the knowledge that my uncle and I haven't spoken in a long time. He likely had no idea my uncle was in contact with family members because of how much my uncle compartmentalized his life. Let's also mention that Mark knew of my family personally because he attended my grandfather's funeral in 2016 and even signed the guest book. We went to my uncle's house later that night and I watched both of them drink Mark's cheap wine that he brought over. He also met my cousin from the Jersey City Police Department at the funeral. And my cousin told my mother that a few years ago Norman had reached out to him asking if he could help out Mark because Mark said his son got in some legal trouble around the area of the Jersey Shore where my cousin lived, and he wanted to know if he had any police connections in that area. But yeah, Mark has no knowledge of Norman's family and no way of getting in contact with anyone. How convenient. Norman's signatures on the will don't even remotely resemble the neat and elegant signature he used throughout his life, which can be seen on the checks he signed. If he was signing this will under duress, that is clearly undue influence, as he likely had no idea what he was signing, and definitely wasn't in any condition to sign anything as he's withering away from terminal cancer. Then there is the incorrect address of my mother, which lists a woman with the same name as her in Barnegat. Norman knows my mother lives in Piscataway, so there's no way in hell he would have listed this address if he drew up this will himself. And that he left his friend's wife everything, and didn't leave anything from his estate to his friend in Ohio's daughters who called him Uncle Norman, is also something I find hard to believe, even if he really didn't want us to have anything, despite saying he was going to leave everything to us and was listing my mother as beneficiary for all of his life insurance policies. But what do I know? I'm just an idiot who shows up to work with a hoodie and tie and a bandana wrapped around my face. Much like how lard-ass Mark Clements tried to claim Norman's New York life insurance policy, he had from his brief stint working at Allied Universal. He also tried to claim the New Jersey Police and Fire pension life insurance policy that was also made out to my mother. My mother spoke to a representative from the pension board who confirmed that she is the beneficiary of the life insurance, but they will have to issue her a new check upon receiving his divorce decrees or proof that all options were exhausted to obtain the divorce decrees, because they received a call a few weeks ago from the executor of Norman's will, requesting to have the information for the life insurance sent to Norman's address in Horsham, Pennsylvania, which is an address my uncle used to evade paying taxes on his New Jersey pension, just like Mark had used for his address in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. However, as I stated before, even if Big Boy tried to contest the life insurance with his fraudulent will stating Norman didn't want his sister and her family to benefit from his estate, Life insurance would simply tell him we don't care what the will says because he could have changed the beneficiaries on his policy when he was alive. Mark and dear friend Michelle also got a final payout from Norman's pension for over $5,000 that was addressed to my mother as the beneficiary, but it was direct deposited into Norman's account, which Mark had access to and had eventually closed. New Jersey Pension Board informed us that if the money was deposited and the account was closed, there's no way the money can be retrieved and a new check cannot be issued. So, Mark literally was able to receive the money from a check issued to my mother because he fraudulently controlled the estate and bank account. My mother spoke to Dr. Allison Matone of the Middlesex County Medical Examiner's Office, who covers several counties including Mercer. And when my mother informed her that Norman had told her that he had to stop chemotherapy 2 weeks before his passing due to the heart blockage, she tells my mother, "Well, if you like, we can change the cause of death on the death certificate." Whiskey, Tango, Foxtrot. We can just change causes of death on death certificates now. She informed my mother that a representative from the medical examiner's office came to the Brennassolini funeral home on February 4th where Mark Clements was waiting for them. Mark presented them with a piece of paper, which was a telehealth report, stating that Norman was taking medication for cancer, and this was good as gospel for them. They photographed the body and performed no autopsy, and then wrote up the death certificate based on Mark Clements' piece of paper, and they took Mark's word that he said Norman had no family. God only knows how many of these situations have happened in the incompetent and careless state of New Jersey when one individual is trying to steal a lonely dying person's estate. The next time my mother spoke with Dr. Allison Matone, this clown show of a medical examiner grew a pair of ovaries and said, "Well, Mark had all the proper paperwork, so we didn't have to locate the next of kin, and we could release the body to him." So, that was her excuse for releasing Norman's body to Mark Clements, so he could have him taken to the funeral home rather than sending someone from the medical examiner's office to photograph his body at his home where he had passed away, which the funeral director said she thought was odd. Dr. Matone laughed when my mother said Norman's body wasn't embalmed and is in rigor mortis by now, and she goes, "Oh, that's what you're worried about? The body not being embalmed? It's not that big of a deal." Of course, she doesn't care because she doesn't have to perform an autopsy to see if there was any foul play involved in Norman's death. She then concluded with, "Well, I'm so sorry you and your family are going through this," in a snarky, sarcastic, condescending, spoiled Jersey girl tone. If anyone has any information or stories about any incompetence involving Dr. Matone or any medical examiners in the state of New Jersey, my email is in the description below. Please contact me and we will do a presentation on medical examiner incompetence in the garbage state. That'll really give that wench something to cry about. My mother had one more conversation with the director of the Brennassolini funeral home. Despite them not making any effort to locate a next of kin, I will at least credit them for providing us the recorded phone call made by Mark Clements on the day of my uncle's passing when he contacted them for someone to pick up his body from his home in Ewing, New Jersey. The director told my mother she thought something was off when Mark had called because he kept pushing for cremation over the phone. She stated you wouldn't believe how many times over the years someone has tried to push for a quick cremation because they were involved in something shady with the person's death and trying to get a hold of their estate. The funeral director also stated that she found it very odd that the medical examiner didn't send anyone to the place of death, Norman's house, before releasing the body to the funeral home. The incompetent medical examiner essentially released Norman's body to Mark Clements and sent someone to take pictures of his corpse at the funeral home. She also stated she can't believe the surrogate's office didn't flag the will when Mark Clements filed it with them because it's very rare that someone leaves their entire estate to a non-family member. I'm going to play the audio so you can hear Mark Clements trying to push cremation. And you can hear that he is speaking in a very businesslike approach when finding his so-called best friend dead, using language like he expired. You can also hear him blatantly lie, saying him and his wife are next of kin to Norman.
Yes, this is, my name is Mark Clements. I need the funeral home services, please.
Well, hi there. And has a loved one just passed away, Mark?
Yes, ma'am. I'm over here at 1011 Parkside Ave with a Ewing police officer. And I had a friend of mine that I've been watching and taking care of and checking in on. When I came in today, he expired.
Hi, Mark. This is Maria. How can I help you?
Maria, unfortunately, I came to see my friend who I've been checking in on and taking care of since he became ill and passed away.
Okay. And what is his name?
Norman J. Cullen, Jr.
Cullen?
Yes, ma'am.
And what address is he at?
He's at 1011 Parkside Ave in Ewing, New Jersey.
Okay. And does he have any next of kin or no?
It's actually me and my family.
Okay.
And I'm his business partner, best friend. I'm the executor of the will. I have power of attorney.
All right. Your power of attorney died with him, but
that's right.
Yeah. So okay. And then Mark, your last name is?
My last name is Clements. Clements. Now, speaking with my attorney about that, he said that the executor, if Norm, who he is estranged from his family, I can handle these responsibilities.
You can handle it to the extent you can bury him, but you can't cremate him.
Really?
Unless he appointed you in his will to act as his funeral agent. It's specific wording.
I believe he did. I've got all that stuff. I'm going to walk back inside. I just went out to my car to get my stuff.
Okay. So yeah. If he appointed you to act as his funeral agent, then you can. We would need to have a copy of that. If you were not, then his next of kin is the only one who can sign for that legally.
I got you. Yeah, I got you.
I mean, you can handle the other part of it, but for authorizing the cremation part, if you're not appointed as the funeral agent, then if he has children or a spouse,
no children, no spouse. Just has a sister.
Okay, then the sister would have to sign if he didn't appoint you.
Yeah, let me get inside here and I could get an idea what I'm reading to you here.
And then were the police there?
Yeah, the Ewing police have been here. There's still one officer here because they're waiting to clear the scene once the ME has somebody on board. So that's why I called you guys because you're extremely close. So he wasn't released yet then by the police? He won't be released until the ME's involved. You guys are there. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Well, the ME's involved. The ME's going to release it to whoever funeral home I'm bringing. Okay, so they did release. Hold on 1 second. So then we can come. I'm going to put you on. I'm going to put you on speaker. Hold on. Okay.
So that is she said that you guys can come take custody of Norman over here, and however, she is going to have to come to her funeral home tomorrow morning. She said, and take pictures because we're unsure of his primary doctor at this time. So I think they have to photograph Norman before she officially releases him. But she said you guys are good to come take him. So the ME needs to come take photos. Okay. Do you know who you talked to at the medical examiner's office? What was that? Yeah, it was Drew Dale. Drew Dale. Okay. Yeah. I'll call you back because we'll set an appointment to meet, and then I'll need to see your documents to see if, you've been appointed to act as a funeral agent. If not, we'll have to get a hold of his sister to have her, sign them, whether we send them for a doctor sign.
I'm reading through first, second, third, fourth paragraphs right now, fifth paragraph. I think we're good to go, but no worries. What do you need to do? Okay. I'll give you a call back in a little bit to get the appointment set, and then meanwhile, I'll dispatch the guys to come get him picked up right away. Thank you. And my condolences. You're welcome. All right. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Does that sound like someone who just lost their best friend? He expired? You can release the body to me? Let me talk to my lawyer. Yeah, I think we got everything in order for cremation. Who's his next of kin? Me, my wife. Well, he has a sister. So lying to a funeral home is legal in the state of New Jersey. There are no legal or disciplinary action if you do so, as there's no specific statute in New Jersey law stating that you will receive criminal charges if you attempt to defraud a funeral home or cemetery to illegally gain advantage of the decedent's estate. This makes robbing an estate that much easier when you don't have to worry about facing charges of defrauding a funeral home, now doesn't it? And for anyone who might say, oh, Mark was a homicide detective and that's just how he's used to talking when dealing with death, just know, as my cousin from the Jersey City Police Department stated, when I'm dealing with a loss or a tragedy involving a loved one, my police brain is now completely turned off and I'm being a human being. He stated that it sounded like Mark was making a business call and he heard no emotion or remorse in his voice whatsoever. The rest of you heard it too. As for dealing with lawyers, well, what a comedy show that was. Most law firms, even ones that say they deal with disputes and negligence involving funeral homes, cemeteries, and medical examiners' offices, said that they don't do these types of cases. Without even listening to a brief summary of the case to see if it's a case they could possibly handle, many firms would ask for $300 to $400 consultation fees, which we certainly aren't going to pay if it's a case that they wouldn't represent anyway. The lawyers that did hear us out told us they need a $15,000 retainer and that the case would likely end up costing at least $50,000 after expenses for man-hours and legal experts. We had one lawyer who was over 80 years old who kept saying he was going to take the case because he found it very interesting, and whenever we asked him what the retainer would be, he'd say it's just a piece of paper, and he never sent it. We then found out he was definitely in the early stages of Alzheimer's based on emails he was sending us discussing completely unrelated cases. One lawyer who was referred to us by a lawyer who was at my uncle's wedding and my mother's wedding, who was an old acquaintance of my uncle and my father, seemed very gung-ho about the case, and 2 days after he had a consultation with my mother when she paid him $400 for this fee, he said due to an issue in his office he would no longer be able to represent us. But here's the name and number of another attorney who will probably also want $400 and then say God knows what. My guess is someone in this attorney's office brought to his attention who Mark Clements was, and they decided, no, we're not touching this case. I called the Ewing Police Department to get an incident report about the potential fraud committed by Mark Clements so we could try to pursue a criminal case against him. The one officer who was taking the report, who seemed to be into it at first, then had another officer whispering to him when I was on the phone, and suddenly he changed course and said that we would have to go to civil court in Trenton because they can't tell if this case is criminal or civil. So my youngest sister goes to Trenton the next day, and civil court tells her that they don't know if this case is criminal or civil, and that we should have an attorney, one of these ones that want $50,000, to file the complaints for us. When she asked this person if we can represent ourselves in court, this representative of civil court said no, and when my sister asked her what forms would an attorney use to contest a will in court, this representative told her that they don't have any specific forms to contest the will, and the attorney who we should be using will draft their own. Wow. And these people are called public servants. When my sister went to the Ewing Police Department to pick up the incident report that they told me she could pick up, they then said we need to file an Oprah request to pick up that report, as well as the report from the day of Norman's death. My cousin from the Jersey City Police Department filed an Oprah request to receive these reports after hearing this, and to this day, he still hasn't received those reports. I'm sure the Ewing Police Department will swear up and down their sisters' asses that they're not covering for Mark Clements, but there's no doubt once they piece together what was going on, with Mark Clements and my uncle's death. Whatever individual Mark knows in that police department with some juice is certainly maintaining the blue wall of silence, back in the blue and back in their boy. Yet when criminals and hoodlums say stop snitching, these police departments go on these campaigns to damn them to hell when they themselves do the exact same thing with their blue wall of silence. We tried contacting the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office, the New Jersey State Police, and the New Jersey Attorney General's Office, and they all said that this must be handled at the municipal level first. So how can we handle it at the municipal level when the municipality, Ewing, refuses to do anything? So the 4-month time frame to contest the will is passed. We decided not to use the $50,000 we received between the 4 of us from Norman's New Jersey Police and Fire Life Insurance Pension to pay for legal fees, because at this point the door was slammed in our face in every direction, and we figured whatever judge we would have to go in front of is probably a drinking buddy of Mark Clements, and despite whatever slam dunk evidence would be presented, he'd simply ignore it, rule in Mark's favor, and we'd be out the little peanuts that we did receive. As for Mark Clements and his connections, I can tell you firsthand from working with him and knowing him that he is very well connected in law enforcement and government. There's no questions asked he knows someone in the Ewing Police Department who can throw their weight around. And in case anyone thinks that Mark Clements is some pillar of the community because he was an ex-cop, let's remember that in 2009, he was charged with making anonymous text message threats to 3 different employees of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office when he was a homicide detective sergeant for them, and he was suspended first with pay and then without pay. He had a salary of over $113,000 back then, which in 2009 was very good money. But in 2025, he might have had to commit more crimes and fraud to compensate for inflation. He was too much of a coward to let them know he had a beef with them, I suppose, hence the anonymous text messages. His tough guy high school football days were long behind him when he was 49 years old in 2009, and they're even further behind him at 65 years old today. I usually don't involve family members in anything, and like I said, I met Mark's wife and 2 kids, and I have nothing against them to this day, and I think they were genuinely nice people, so I won't include them in this, even though they're probably going to dislike me for this presentation, but all good. But I will include his brother, Brian Clements. I knew he had a brother that was behind bars when I worked with him back in 2016 and 17. And I came to find out that his brother was incarcerated for vehicular homicide while intoxicated when he ran over a 52-year-old Mexican woman by the name of Sylvia Reyes Ramos in New Brunswick in 2012 while she was walking to church, in which he received a 13-year sentence. He pulled a hit and run, and his Ford Edge was identified by cameras near the scene of the incident. So despite Mark's pull in Middlesex County, not even him and his cronies could cover that one up. And Brian Clements sat there in court, telling the decedent's family, "If there's anything I can do, please let me know." Yeah, what you could have done was stop to get her medical help once you ran her over, you drunk jackass. I guess that type of spineless scumbag syndrome runs in the Clements bloodline. Oh, and of course he had police officers there, such as retired East Windsor Lieutenant Joseph Bonavico, to let the court know what a great guy he was. Anyways, if you aren't in enough shock as to the corruption that goes on in the great state of New Jersey, in my next class you're going to be in for a real movies and popcorn night type of treat, because I'm going to present to you the man that helped mold my Uncle Norman and Mark Clements into the men they became. Former Somerset County Prosecutor Nick Bissell, who operated the most corrupt prosecutor's office in modern American history, literally, from the 1980s to the mid-90s. This is where my uncle and Fat Boy became friends as detective henchmen for that clown show. Please like and subscribe to receive notifications as to when Professor Tone is holding class, because I promise you that you do not want to miss that presentation. You are not going to believe what you see and hear. And for any of you brainwashed citizens that still to this day for some reason believe these things can't happen in America, let me tell you that, oh yes, they did happen. And I know firsthand some things that happened back in those days, especially when my uncle would have a few too many drinks at happy hour and sit down for story time. Now, I will save some other stories I have for individual detectives and cops throughout Somerset County during the Bissell Reign of Terror for a separate episode from that one. I'm going to let that one marinate. I'm also going to get others who were abused by law enforcement in Somerset County during that time frame to tell me their stories, and as long as they come to me with the facts, I will present them as well. Now, I want you former Bissell henchmen and affiliates in law enforcement during that time in Somerset County to listen very closely. I know your names, I know what you did, and at a time of my choosing, the whole world is going to know what you did. If you don't like it, come to me like a man and say or do something about it. If you feel you're too old and feeble to do something about it, send a friend. Or send one of your offspring to do something about it. Now, with that said, based on what I've seen from the offspring you slobs have produced, I wouldn't advise sending them to me if a physical confrontation is what you have in mind. I really wouldn't do that to them, as they will certainly get themselves hurt. Oh boy, heroes. Not my heroes. Now, for all of you law enforcement officers who I personally like, whether you're a longtime friend, a work colleague from my days working for the city of Philadelphia, or a fellow soldier from my days in the military, I still love you guys, even if what I just said offends you and causes you to hate me. Hell, if you guys ever needed anything and needed someone to get your back, I'd do whatever I could for you. But I'm sorry, yet not sorry, that myself and my family will never support law enforcement after this debacle. Once that badge goes on, that means you're at work for this government. And when you're at work for this government, there's a separation between us that can't be mended. My son, my niece, and 3 nephews were legally robbed of hundreds of thousands of dollars that would have went to them from my uncle. But law enforcement and government turned a blind eye and gave us the cold shoulder to protect that fat pig of theirs. There will be no support from me. And you can bet if I did what should be allowed and beat Fat Boy's ass until he hands over everything he stole, oh boy, there would be SWAT teams from 6 different counties surrounding me and a team full of prosecutors looking me to put me away for 25 years if that happened. And I know some of you cops saw the Facebook post my mother had made about this incident. Many people replied, all saying they can't believe how this scumbag got away with this. But you know who didn't reply? The cops. They all maintained silence. All the ones my mother knows that claim they'll do anything to help, and all these cops that were supposedly Norman's friend didn't have a damn thing to say once they found out Marky Mark from the Funny Bunch committed crimes. Anyone who's heard about this from day one says there's no way this guy can get away with this. Well, he did. The corruption and incompetence of law enforcement in New Jersey government exceeded even my expectations, and I knew it was bad. So how about it, Detective Clements? I use that title loosely, considering you missed quite a few spots committing your fraud, and you only got away with it because you were assisted and backed by your fellow boys in blue in incompetence and carelessness in government, in a state which, for close to the last century, has annually been the most politically corrupt state in the Union. If I'm wrong, Marky, and you can prove that my uncle wanted your wife, dear friend Michelle, to have everything he worked for in his life, then present the facts that you have. Maybe you can explain how everything I said is BS. You should have an answer as to how you couldn't find the phone number for my mother that appears 4 times on the first page of a Google search, and you can explain how my uncle would have put an address in Barnegat for a different person with the same name as her when he certainly knows where his sister lives. You can explain why you didn't tell anyone about Norman's death until a month after he passed. You can explain why you were telling the Brenna Cellini funeral home that you and your wife were next of kin to Norman. You can explain how he didn't have any family and you didn't know how to contact them when you worked with me doing private investigations. Still had my email address, and you were the regional manager when I did work for them. You met Norman's family when you were at his father's funeral, and you remembered his cousin when your son needed help with his legal trouble. You can explain what type of care you were giving him in his dying days when you were periodically checking in on him. You can explain why you use a fraudulent address on the will and death certificate as your domicile, even though you don't live there, so you can defraud the state of New Jersey taxpayers by not paying income tax on your police pension, and how we should all believe that despite that, everything else you say is gospel. You can say why it was so important that you went to Virginia to get your waterfront property instead of going to your best friend's burial, in which you selected the cheapest burial option, $800 to be exact, which didn't even include a vaulted casket so his body can instantly decompose, and how you specifically told them to bury him as a ward of the state when he wished to be cremated, and you let him rot 20 feet deep in a mass grave with several other people, all because you didn't want his family to find out about the fraud you committed. Bet you didn't think my mother had a key to the house, did you? You can explain to the friends and family he had that would have liked to say goodbye to him before he passed and honor him in their own way, even though he didn't want a viewing ceremony, why you couldn't contact anyone about his passing, and why you felt the need to rob them of their opportunity to mourn him. You want me to keep going? The floor is yours to plead your case, but you won't. You knew your way around all the red tape of this legal system, and now you just got Norman's house for free and had it remodeled so you could put it on the market for almost $400,000. Wow. Nicely done. I hope the class learned a lot from your fraud and deceit, Marky, as to how to rob an estate. And just know, I didn't slander you or defame your character. You slandered yourself and defamed your own character with your actions to commit fraud to steal my uncle's estate, and I simply presented the facts. Ditto for the Ewing Police Department and all other inept people and agencies mentioned here today. I don't own anything, and nothing is in my name, so not sure what you could even sue for, even if you did have a case. Unless you want some debt, which in that case, it's all yours. Also, there were 2 other life insurance policies that listed my mother as the beneficiary that will continue to sit as unclaimed because, unfortunately, we can't claim them because they're made out to the estate of Norman. So we will let that money rot before dear friend Michelle gets another cent on top of what her executor husband has already stolen from us. As for lawsuits, if anyone with any legal knowledge in the realm of funeral and disposition of remains, or anyone who is a lawyer that handles these types of cases in New Jersey can answer me this, I'd really like to know if there is a criminal and civil case against Mark Clements, because according to the 2024 New Jersey Revised Statutes, Title 45, Professions and Occupations, Section 452722, Control of Funeral Disposition of Remains, Priority Classes, there is a subsection that states, reasonable attempt to notify, which means a good faith effort to contact the person or persons with the right to control the funeral and disposition, which means contacting my mother, who was next of kin, via correspondence sent by registered mail or electronic mail to his or her last known address, or a telephone call placed to the last known telephone number by a family member, personal representative of the decedent, or any other interested party. If a reasonable attempt to notify is unsuccessful, the person or persons assuming the right to control the funeral and disposition shall attest in writing that a good faith effort was made to contact any person or persons with a high priority right to control. You have proof of your good faith effort, fat boy? Do you as executor have to make the effort? Does the funeral home have to make the effort to contact the cemetery, the medical examiner's office? Who is supposed to make this good faith effort? Because obviously no one did. Section D of this subsection also states that a person who signs an authorization for the funeral and disposition of human remains, which Mark Clements signed, warrants the truth of the facts stated, the identity of the person whose remains are disposed, and the authority to order the disposition. The person shall be liable for damages caused by a false statement or a breach of warranty. I already demonstrated his false statements. A cemetery or funeral director shall not be liable for disposition in accordance with the authorization unless they had reasonable notice that the representations were untrue or that the person lacked the right to control the disposition. Please, any legal advice as to the fraudulent statements of Mark Clements in this case would be greatly appreciated, and any information as to the negligence of the funeral home, cemetery, or medical examiners would also be greatly appreciated. All of this information is going to be sent to municipal, county, state, congressional offices and representatives, and I will not stop till Mark Clements pays for what he did. On that happy note, if you have any knowledge as to this incident involving my uncle and fat boy Mark Clements, please contact me with the facts. If you are someone who has or knows someone who has had an estate defrauded, also let me know with the facts, as I will do a presentation in the future on others who have suffered this same fate as my family. I'll see you back in our next class about good old American county corruption in New Jersey. Until next time, not even the bell can save you when you're in class with Professor Tone.